Good morning to all, and welcome to DiploFoundation webinar on Wikipedia for diplomats. One of the goals that we have in this webinar today is to facilitate and promote a dialogue between two groups. One is the Wikipedia community, and the other is the diplomatic community. And there is a clear intersection between both groups that is usually overlooked. Both rely heavily on information for their activities. The Wikipedia community uses collective knowledge and intelligence to develop a widely accessible encyclopedia. And maybe it's interesting to notice that the figures of Wikipedia today are quite impressive. There are more than 4 million articles on Wikipedia today, with an average of 20 edits per page, which shows a high level of involvement from the community. And in addition to that, it's interesting to notice that Wikipedia is number 6 on the number of web traffic, considering the access of visitors, and it's only behind sites of search engines such as Google and Yahoo, or platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. So it's massively popular. But we probably don't need the numbers to tell us that, because Wikipedia is usually the first search. When we search things on the web, it's usually the first site that we will find. And probably many of us consult Wikipedia in an almost daily basis. So we're going to discuss with this background. Our debate will be guided by 2 main questions in this webinar today. The first one is how reliable Wikipedia is as one of the main sources of information for diplomats. And we know that information is a key element in diplomatic work. We may even say that information is to diplomats what money is to bankers. And gathering, making sense, and organizing information is fundamental in at least 2 diplomatic activities. The first one is diplomatic reporting, and the second one is convey information to the public, in which an activity that we call public diplomacy efforts. So the first question is that, how reliable is Wikipedia as one of the main sources of information for diplomats? And to discuss that, we have here today with us Bence Damokos, who is from Wikimedia Affiliations Committee, and we have Richard Boly, who is the Director of eDiplomacy of the US State Department. I'm going to explain to you the dynamics of the debate very briefly. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to share his views, and in the meantime, our remote participation moderator, Virginia Pack, will be collecting your comments and questions and forwarding them to us. And please do feel encouraged to make comments and questions. And after that, each speaker will have 3 minutes to reply and make final comments. And then we will move on to the second question of this debate. So before we start, I just would like to make one final comment, which is this webinar on Wikipedia for diplomats is part of a larger initiative by DiploFoundation to try to bring together these 2 communities, the diplomatic community and the Wikipedia community. And we are going to offer other activities, such as a course specifically on this topic. And if you want to stay informed and have more information about that, you can visit our website on diplomacy.edu. Stay informed about that if you are interested on this topic. So without further delay, I'd like to give the floor to our first speaker, Stefano from the Affiliations. And Bence, please, you have the floor.
Thank you for having me today. Just to give you a brief background, I'm not a diplomat here. I'm just finishing my MA studies in international relations, and I have been a Wikipedian for the past 6 years, and currently lead this Affiliations committee that helps NGOs support the Wikimedia projects worldwide. Today I have a difficult task to speak about the reliability of Wikipedia, because this is a subject that is a bit difficult. There are actually 19 million articles in almost 300 different languages, and Wikipedia itself will be the most critical. So my advice is usually that Wikipedia is a great tool for background research to find out what is the plot of a national epic of a given country, or what is going on in Turkey or Brazil at the moment and why is it relevant. However, it should not be used for critical decisions like how to perform heart surgery or whether to go to war with a given country. And like any other source, one should exercise their own judgment. There are very high quality articles and there are articles that are absolutely useless, and Wikipedia itself, by its structure, gives a few tools, and the editors themselves give a number of tools to the readers to make their own judgment. For example, there are a number of things that I think is useful to know is that Wikipedia is an encyclopedia by genre. That means that it is a collection of information found elsewhere, found in books, newspapers, journal articles. Unlike many other sources, you can expect it to provide the source of the information, so the reader can make their own judgment whether the sources are reliable themselves, and if the use of the information is important, they can actually validate each claim. So if you see an article with good sources and footnotes, you can either rely on it or use it as a basis for your research and check out the facts for yourself. If you see articles with warning banners that there are no sources or, for example, citation needed tags, you should be wary of that article. Secondly, it is important to know that Wikipedia is compiled by internet users. Everyone can edit. They don't even need to register. And this has a few consequences. One of them is that the more people edit a given article, the more likely it is to be error-free and good quality. However, there's a chance that more errors are added as well. There's no guarantee. Wikipedia does not give a guarantee, and edits are not fact-checked. However, this does not devolve into utter chaos because every change is logged and can be accessed through a history tab on the page, and you can see who has edited, and if it's a harmful edit, Wikipedia editors can remove it in 2 clicks. Another useful tool usually here is the bottom of every page that gives you the last modified date, so you know whether the information is current or stale already. And on the discussion pages, you find out whether there's any issue with a given article. Thirdly, Wikipedia's editorial policy is somewhat unique in that it tries to provide a neutral point of view. This is a bit different from other sources that might have an explicit or implicit bias or claim to offer the objective truth. Wikipedia will try to give all the relevant viewpoints for a given subject and give them the weight they have in the real world. So it will tell you what is the mainstream opinion, but it will also show you a criticism section. So if you want to find good articles, you should look out for balanced coverage of a topic. If you see that some aspect is overemphasized, you should be wary that the article does not live up to our standards of offering a neutral and balanced point of view. Usually Wikipedians will give you a warning banner to warn you against this. So if you keep in mind these 3 properties of Wikipedia, that it is a compilation of information found elsewhere and that the information should be validated if it's important for you to check, and that it is freely editable by anyone, allowing error correction, but unfortunately also some new errors to be added, and that it tries to provide a neutral and balanced coverage. You should be able to make your own judgment, like you would make your judgment of any other source you would encounter in your daily life. If you see articles with good lead sections, good style, balance, and neutral coverage, and reliable sources, you should probably be pretty confident that if you go on and actually check into, do more deeper research, you will find that the Wikipedia article was accurate and reliable. If you see that there are warning banners, that there are unsourced opinions or value claims, or the article is slanted towards one direction or the other, you should probably find a better source, or at least double check every information you want to use from there. So in summary, I believe that Wikipedia can be a very useful source of public information for diplomats. especially on local knowledge, local politics, culture. And for example, the English Wikipedia is great at synthesizing breaking news in real time almost. However, Wikipedia does not provide a guarantee, and we don't have much illusions. We recommend that everybody exercise caution, their own judgment, and if it's a critical, if the information has a critical use, then people should double check it. Like, you would not rely on any other encyclopedia if actually you had to have like critical use. Wikipedia is the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bence. And I just would like to share a personal view about that. As you know, the protests have broke out on the streets of Brazil during the past few days. And it was very interesting to see that the coverage that was going on almost live in Wikipedia was the most reliable one and the most true to the facts and that we could find on any media source. So it was really interesting to see how it developed on Wikipedia. And I think it's very interesting what Pierre Levy says in one of his books. He mentioned how the media has been used for political purposes, or sometimes has been misguided and given news that were not really true to the facts. So I think that the need to counter-check and to be careful with the sources is something that we need to take into account, not only with Wikipedia, but with other sources. And by my experience, at least for breaking events, Wikipedia has been one of the most reliable ones that I could find. So thank you very much, Bence. This was really interesting. I'd like to give the floor directly to Richard Boly, who is the Director of eDiplomacy of the U.S. State Department. Richard, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, I want to be able to take a separate approach to this, a different view, even though I'm a strong proponent of Wikipedia. So, and I should say that our office, the Office of eDiplomacy, was a co-sponsor for Wikimedia last year, which was hosted here in Washington, D.C. So, while I may be providing some counter views, at my heart, I'm a deep supporter of Wikipedia. But a couple of reasons why that diplomats may want to be a little bit, not suspect, but at least question some of the things that they find in Wikipedia, is that while there are many hundreds of millions of people who read Wikipedia, there is a much smaller group of Wikipedians who actually edit and contribute to the development of articles. And as my distinguished colleague Bence has demonstrates, when you think about Wikipedians, their demographic actually, Bence fits right in the heart of it. A study that was done, a survey of over 58,000 Wikipedians, that study was published back in March of 2010, provided some information on who Wikipedians are. So who are the people who are contributing to editing of the articles that you read on Wikipedia? And those people, half of them are under age 22, and 3/4 of them, so a full 75% of all Wikipedians are under 30. So that does clearly skew towards a much younger viewpoint, and as diplomats know, we tend to skew towards a more older demographic. We put a strong bias on real-world experience gained over decades. So there is one area where there may be a little bit of cultural difference between the community of Wikipedians, the people who are curating the articles that you read on Wikipedia, and the diplomats who may be reading the articles themselves. Now, another demographic, which is very important, is that a full 87% of Wikipedians are men. Now, this is something that we in the United States certainly have driven very forcefully and aggressively to ensure that our diplomatic corps represents the demographics of the United States. So, we seek to have half of our diplomats be women, half men. And the demographic kind of looks a lot like the citizens that we represent. So if you think of the articles in Wikipedia, being written by a group that is 75% under 30, 87% male, that is a kind of perspective bias that if you were getting that in cable reporting, official reporting that you were getting from an embassy, would concern you. So there's, I think, one area that is important for us to be able to take into account is the source. Who are the people that are contributing that information? We all carry biases and personal perspectives to everything that we do, and so that's one thing to take into account. Another point I think that's equally important is what are the things that are of most interest to that demographic? Men under 30. Not always the same things that are of interest to to the broader diplomatic community. So I was just looking at some articles yesterday on Wikipedia. I will have to tell you why I sometimes say Diplopedia and sometimes say Wikipedia. I'll give a little parenthetical at the end on that. Wikipedia, I was looking for some information and looking at some articles that I knew that there had been recent changes and wanted to see if they were reflected actually in Wikipedia without actually going in and changing them myself, so you could look at yourself. One was on Cheryl Mills. Cheryl Mills was the chief of staff and counselor to Secretary Clinton when Secretary Clinton was the Secretary of State. Her article in Wikipedia still lists her as counselor, although she left in February of this year. So that's not the kind of article maybe that people who are 87% men and 30% under, or 75% under 30 are kind of tracking closely to make sure they change when events, when history unfolds and events change. Another thing I think that's important to say, especially for diplomats, is for sources where we are personally involved. Oftentimes, we have personal experience, which is not public knowledge, that is not reflected in Wikipedia. I know the example of one ambassador who is extremely frustrated that there are press reports around his activities as ambassador, which he knows personally to be incorrect and frankly reflects unfavorably on him, but there is nothing in the public record to support his position. So he has no way of kind of defending his own reputation, and yet people who want to take the opposing view have plenty of press reports to bolster their position. So there's a personal, circumstance of an individual ambassador who finds Wikipedia to be, very challenging and provides a sense of authoritative information about him personally, which he knows to be not true, and yet he has no recourse to set the record straight because he has no public record source of information that he can refer to. So, now I wanted to give just a brief parenthetical about why I make the split between Diplopedia and Wikipedia. And that is because the State Department has its own internal wiki. It's called Diplopedia. It has 17,000 articles, about 6,000 Diplopedians, who are people within the State Department who create articles, and about 35,000 page views a week. And And just like I often say, when you go to Wikipedia to find something about an issue, so say you're interested in knowing more about Star Wars, well, you go to Wikipedia to find out something about Star Wars, the movie series. But if you want to know everything about Star Wars, you go to Wikipedia, because that's where everybody who cares about Star Wars goes into great detail that you would never find on Wikipedia. So I agree that Wikipedia is a good first step, and then there's oftentimes even deeper dives, more focused sources of information. In our case, about diplomacy in the State Department, it is our source. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was really interesting. I think that you bring in some issues that I do not generally see being raised on this debate, which is the gender perspective, the age perspective, the personal circumstances of people who edit Wikipedia. But my question, and maybe Bence can comment about it later on. First of all, is that is there any policy from Wikipedia community or Wikimedia to try to bring diversity, I mean gender diversity, geographical diversity into building the Wikipedia, into the project? And my second question, maybe to Richard, is I see your point on gender and the personal circumstances, such as the history you told us about the diplomat that could not set the record straight on Wikipedia and so on. But how different do you see this from the traditional media channels? Because usually if you take the newspapers, we have many male journalists and people under this age or that age, or maybe if you have the data but you can bring this data public, you will not be able to set the record straight on the traditional media as well. So what is the difference that you notice? But before I give you the floor again, let me just bring in some comments from people who are watching us now. First of all, a comment from Omar, who says, I have an iPad offline version of Wikipedia in Cuba, and it's my only reference to being offline all the time. So he raises the point of the importance of Wikipedia to him as well. Newton said, reliability, it's an issue for him. It was a key problem with Wikipedia in general, but it seems that the content has significantly improved recently. So he makes this point about improving content and how Wikipedia has improved and grown. So I'd like to give the floor to Bence again, and remind you that you can send us your comments and questions throughout this debate. We'll be receiving and forwarding them to the speakers. And now I would like to give the floor to Bence so he can make comments and then to Richard.
Thank you again. So I think Richard raised quite a few points that are actually well understood in the Wikipedia movement. For example, gender diversity is like the #1 issue that comes up in discussions, and every program, public program we try to do, we look at the gender ratio and try to raise it. Personally, I think the consequence is more of what is left out. So for example, we lack voices from women, we lack voices from some of the global south or Africa, and we lack voices from the diplomatic community who don't edit, which results in articles missing or information missing. I don't think it results in wrong information added or in a degradation of quality of what is there, but it definitely results in a void of information missing. And so that's one of the things why I think this initiative by the DiploFoundation looks interesting, because it could be one way to bridge that gap. The Wikimedia Foundation itself is working on bridging some of the gaps. It is trying to bring Wikipedia through free access to global south countries through mobile phones. It is trying to improve the software so people can actually edit and add to it through their mobile phones. And the other issue Richard raises is the sources. So the diplomat in question couldn't change or couldn't have his public record set straight because information about him was not public that would have set it straight. And that's actually one of the built-in characteristics of Wikipedia, that it it is based on public information and information found elsewhere. So, for example, if the person in question had a way to make his own point of view public, it could have been incorporated into the article, but as it is not public, it cannot be like cannot be part of the public record by definition. And this is actually a problem on a wider scale. If you think about cultures that are not predominantly written, like that keep their culture in oral form, sometimes have trouble making sure that information about them is actually findable on Wikipedia or on traditional encyclopedias that rely on written sources. So this is kind of like a general problem. And as for Cheryl Mills, I'm sure Wikipedians watching this article will correct it in a matter of hours or minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bence. I'd like to give the floor to Richard for his comments.
Yes, I mean, I agree, and I know that from our participation in Wikimania last year, that there really was a huge focus on trying to recruit and encourage more diversity of voices among Wikipedians. And you know, the challenge is it is a self-selected group. It's the people who choose to engage in developing this wonderful global resource and crowdsource it, and encouraging people to feel welcome to do that, and finding ways for a diverse group of people to see within their spare time, this is something that I can do. You know, of course, it would be wonderful, but you know, the challenge is it's self-selection, and so people need to see it in a way, you know, women and older people and people from the global south see it in a way of, first of all, that it's available and accessible, and second, that it's rewarding, and third, that it's kind of a valuable use of their time. So that's the challenge. As to the difference between Wikipedia as a source and traditional journalism, obviously, in traditional journalism, for better or worse, you oftentimes understand the bias of the paper or the source itself. So you say, well, this is a liberal, this is a conservative, this is a libertarian, this is a pro-statist, this is a feminist viewpoint, this is a reactionary viewpoint, and so there is kind of this contextual layer to your source, and that that can be helpful. It can also lead to skewing, where people will listen only to voices that reaffirm their own beliefs, and Wikipedia is free of that, in that the people who are participating represent these diverse viewpoints. But as we saw from the demographics, it's just an inherent challenge in the Wikipedia movement, is attracting those people with diverse demographics, which would imply that they represent the viewpoint of those demographics that are relatively absent from the Wikipedia movement. That said, as I said at the upfront, I'm a huge supporter of Wikipedia. I think it's a tremendous resource, and the challenges that I've identified are challenges that Wikipedians have identified long ago and are doing everything possible to remedy. So I encourage people to use it, and encourage diplomats themselves, experts, to come in and become active on Wikipedia. We did actually have many discussions with the World Bank about having their experts come in and take information that they had that was a public record and ensure that it was reflected in articles on Wikipedia. So we're active in encouraging the subject matter experts to become involved and to embrace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's interesting to see we have conducted a small poll with our participants, and 90% of people have said that they use Wikipedia on a regular basis. So as we were saying, it's widespread, it's popular, and it proves to be useful because people are using that much. It's useful in their lives. 88% say that they are a regular Wikipedia contributor as editors, and 0 said I don't use Wikipedia. So this is one conclusion that we can make. It's valuable, so it's worth to invest efforts to make it better. And I think that Omar has made another point that I think is important. He mentions that Wikipedia is as reliable as the way that the information is written. So I think that when you see an article, you have cues to tell you how reliable the information is, how it brings in other sources to support views and so on, links to external sources as well. So I think that you can tear a little bit of information apart when you see an article. And he mentions that he can always do further investigation if he feels that he needs to do it. So it doesn't seem to be a problem for him. And so with that, I'd like to close this first part of our debate and thank Bence and Richard, our speakers, and move on to the second part of this conversation, which is also very interesting, because we are asking here, can Wikipedia be used effectively for public diplomacy? As we saw, Wikipedia is widely used by people, so it's a tremendously important way of getting people informed about things. And how this information from diplomats and from a Ministry of External Relations can be reflected in Wikipedia in a way that also respects the norms and editing of Wikipedia, the style and norms of editing. This is something that we're going to discuss now with Stefano Baldi. He is the director of the Italian Diplomatic Institute of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Jovan, Kurbalija, who is the director of DiploFoundation. I'd like to give the floor to Stefano.
Thank you, Marilia. Thank you very much, and thank you to Bence and Richard for the first part, which I think was an extremely valid and interesting introduction, or more than introduction, set the pace of this discussion a little bit on Wikipedia. I have problems to see really who is against it, but it's difficult to be against, I would say. But for me, so don't expect from me too many negative things. But of course, it doesn't mean that as diplomats, as professionals working in international affairs, we should not be extremely aware of what it means to use Wikipedia. So up to now, I think we mainly spoke about Wikipedia being used passively, which means, consulting Wikipedia. When we shift to the public diplomacy, as we do in the second part, we start thinking and I think considering Wikipedia as an asset, as a tool to perform the activity of public diplomacy. So what is public diplomacy? I don't want to, of course, to have a lesson on this. It's a wide topic, and that would be more than enough to cover not 8 but 80 minutes. But certainly, it's an extremely important activities in the Foreign Office, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's about communication. It's about spreading information. It's about convincing others about something which we think it's right, it's correct, is accurate. It's trying to be influential. That's I would say the key of the public diplomacy. And to do so, we should be able to not only to spread some kind of information, but also to amplify the information. When I see this description that I just given, I'm already thinking of a tool as Wikipedia, because all these elements that I just mentioned are in a way achievable, can be implemented through Wikipedia. So there is another element I think that we should consider in Wikipedia, which are quite important to take into consideration nowadays, in the public administration and even in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is money, which is the cost, which is, the resources that you need to do all this. In fact, as a matter of fact, the Wikipedia is inexpensive for these activities, if you think about it. It's a very extremely efficient tool where cost benefit is extremely high, or is extremely positive. It depends on what you mean by high. So all these elements makes, I believe, a Wikipedia a perfect instrument for public diplomacy activities. And I am rather surprised by the fact that this is not still perceived. I have this impression in many ministries, in many activities. It's still, the discussion is still about, is Wikipedia reliable, which was our first part. It's not what can we do for Wikipedia and what can Wikipedia do for us, for our activities. That should be the question, and that is the question. I would say that at least in our activities of the Institute, in terms of training for young diplomats, we have been doing some work along this line, trying to examine a bit more deeply the possibility and the opportunities of Wikipedia in terms of external communication, in terms of contacts with the outside world, not only in terms of getting the information. That I will not examine. So in terms of providing information, certainly there is the possibility to contribute to Wikipedia, as it was said before. Contribute means writing new articles, or more often participating to articles which are already there, and maybe complementing them, correcting them through public available information. And there is a lot of public available information which is not there and which is linked to the activities of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example. We have an example that we performed during our training sessions here at the Institute, which was to look into the Italian Wikipedia. So in a way, this is, looking into the possibility of making more known in Italy. So this is an internal, domestic market, but it's not very different when you are abroad. To look in the Italian Wikipedia, how much information was available about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all the elements which are related to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and how accurate it was. And of course, what we discovered, that there were a lot of inaccuracies in terms of information which was missing, information which was not balanced. You talk about, for example, one section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is not necessarily the most relevant one or the most active, and there is nothing about another one. So this gives, for all those people who are using the Wikipedia as an information source, an unbalanced view. So we started to contribute to this part of the Wikipedia articles. For example, the article on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministero degli Affari Esteri, trying to enlarge the information using publicly available information. And we think, and we realized, that there was really an increase in the kind of deep information which was given. In fact, if we think of the past, in the past there was this tendency, for example, to produce leaflets, or I don't know, to put information on the websites more recently, which is important, of course. But we cannot forget, as it was said before, that if somebody look into a Google search for Ministero degli Affari Esteri, probably the first item that will come on top will be the Wikipedia, not necessarily the site of the ministry, or anyway the second will be Wikipedia. So that proves that we should pay a lot of attention on what is there and also participate actively. That would be certainly a very good service to make, and that's what we are trying to do in, for example, training our diplomats to be able to edit the Wikipedia articles. If you think, and now I will conclude of this, if you are posted to a country and there is a local Wikipedia with the local language, how much important it is to have an accurate article on the country you represent, you know, in that particular Wikipedia. I think it is extremely important, and certainly we can contribute to that. Of course, sometimes it can be even interesting to have a discussion on that, because we know the discussions that there are on some articles, and to participate actively to the discussion so that the image of the country, which is at the basis of a public diplomacy, is well reflected. This is just an example. I see that my 8 minutes are exhausted. Of course, there are many others, but I want to keep the time that was allotted to me. So I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And I think you bring an interesting point. There are many countries that are investing a lot in public diplomacy strategies, and many of them, just like Brazil and US and many others, have started trying to have a more strong presence on social networks such as Facebook and Twitter and so on. But I don't see in general that Wikipedia is being considered on the strategies of public diplomacy the way it should, if we compare to the accessibility and with the popularity that Wikipedia has with people worldwide. So it's very interesting to ask ourselves what we as diplomats or as experts on international relations should be doing to improve the articles in that sense and participate in this dialogue, absolutely. We have some opinions that are coming from our viewers. 23% say that Wikipedia is not a main source of information for them, but 38% say that it is a good starting point. They start looking at Wikipedia and after they go for other sources. 8% say that it's not a verifiable source, so it's not very reliable. 23% it's not reliable alone, but if you couple it with other sources, then it's a useful source. And 8% acknowledge that it has progressed a lot over time, so it's becoming more and more reliable. So this is what we have coming from our viewers right now. Keep coming, more comments and questions to us. And now I'd like to give the floor to Jovan, who is the director of DiploFoundation. Jovan, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marilia. Good afternoon or good morning. It is difficult to add anything substantial after the excellent presentation by Bence, Richard, and Stefano. I will just try to focus and to add a few points on the question of public diplomacy in Wikipedia. A few years ago, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, Stefano and I started discussion on Wikipedia and diplomacy. When he noticed inaccuracy on Italian website, serious inaccuracy on one writing on Italian diplomatic service. And then we realized that in order to correct that inaccuracy, one needs to go through the whole politics of Wikipedia, who has the right to do it, ultimately coming to the voting. Therefore, it was an interesting journey into the Wikipedia world, and I've been learning a lot about it and discovering dynamics which Richard described very well about the relatively limited group of people in charge of editing Wikipedia articles. I think it is important to keep in mind, and also to make aware diplomats that information on Wikipedia cannot be fixed by démarche or official letter to director of the Wikipedia or the Bence, who is the head of the affiliation committee. There are different ways, which is good. And I will come later on to that point of the quality of Wikipedia. Now, a good point for this presentation is that it is one of the rare topics which are intuitive. You don't need to read 1,000 books or articles. You can just make a search on Google and find the article on Wikipedia of relevance for foreign policy or diplomacy or Italy, Malta, Switzerland, Brazil. And I'm sure in few articles you can find the points that could be improved. Therefore, it is very concrete, down to earth, and I advise our colleagues that people who are following our presentation to do this search and to identify areas where the improvements are possible and new articles could be added. Now, this is the intuitive aspect of the relation between public diplomacy and Wikipedia. Counterintuitive, which was raised by Stefano in his presentation, is really slow reaction of diplomatic services. We did an informal and short comparative survey about the funding for public diplomacy and position of Wikipedia in public diplomacy strategies of ministries of foreign affairs. In spite of budgets which are sometimes in the terms of billions, US probably, who is the major player in public diplomacy, has in 2011 budget of 1.3 billion US dollars. Other countries are within the range of 100 middle-ranking countries, 100 to 200 million US dollars, and coming to smaller countries in which have a budget of a few $1,000,000. But what is amazing is that at least in publicly available documents, you cannot find any indication about use of Wikipedia for public diplomacy purposes. Therefore, it is a counterintuitive position where public diplomacy strategies do not reflect reality, and reality is that many people rely on Wikipedia information. Now, good sign and good news for public diplomacy is the way how Wikipedia treats information. As we know, public diplomacy is sometimes associated with propaganda, broadcasting, distortion of information, and the other tools. When it comes to Wikipedia, the editorial policy of Wikipedia and the whole vetting procedure and possibility to edit information is a good safeguarding mechanism for diplomats and all involved in the public diplomacy activities, which can ensure the quality of information and reliably robust public diplomacy. I think it is a good element which can come from the merger between public diplomacy and Wikipedia tools. Now, Stefano mentioned one example from Italian diplomatic service. Unfortunately, it is a unique example of integrating Wikipedia in training activities of ministries of foreign affairs. And a lot has to be done. And ministries of foreign affairs and diplomatic services should rely more on crowdsourcing, on utilizing expertise of future diplomats. Bence is a student of the international relations. He is most likely future diplomat, and he is already high-ranking official of the Wikipedia community. There are people in every country who are interested in diplomatic issues and international relations. And the training or integration of Wikipedia writing in training of diplomats or international relations specialists could be beneficial both for Wikipedia and diplomatic services. It can also include elements of drafting of diplomatic documents and reporting. Elements of Wikipedia style could also, in this cross-fertilization, influence a more effective diplomatic reporting, which is done by diplomatic services internally. Stefano mentioned the importance of Wikipedia in different languages. It is extremely important, and Wikipedia in local languages can help customization of the message and public diplomacy efforts. I think we are at the very beginning of trying to bridge this existing gap between Wikipedia world and diplomatic world, and through this bridging we can do a lot for cross-fertilization of both public diplomacy and Wikipedia. And it is exciting to be at the beginning of this journey and to have such a good steward of this process in Marilia. Over to you, Marilia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jovan. I'd like to go straight to some comments that have come from the people who are watching us. And the first one is an example. There have been embassies, just like Estonian and Norwegian, that have organized article writing contests to improve the coverage of their countries on the respective Wikipedia articles. I think this is something really interesting because it involves not only the Wikipedia community, but also the experts and students on international relations, besides the diplomats, to join together and to improve these articles. So I think it creates a habit not only to contribute to Wikipedia, but also to see this with a very hands-on approach, that it can be an instrument for public diplomacy as well. This was really interesting. Another comment comes from Newton, and he says, if you don't write for Wikipedia, then you leave an empty field for others to do that. And I think he's absolutely right. If you don't speak up, it's a political space like any other space. We're going to counter-check information. We're going to stay close to the facts as much as possible, but there are no empty spaces on this world. Someone is always occupying them. And it's better if Ministry of External Relations use this space to promote information that they have very easily on their hands and share with others, with the public. We have another poll coming up regarding the question, can Wikipedia be used for effective public diplomacy? 63% of our viewers say yes, for basic information to the public. 25% say yes, it is important to publish information. And 13% say no, it doesn't help credibility. So this is what is coming to us right now. I'd like to give the floor then to Stefano again for him to make his closing remarks and comments about what is coming to us, and then after that to Jovan. Stefano, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, if I can just take the opportunity to say something on the last issue that you just mentioned, that was commented on the credibility, which also links with the first part of our discussion today. I take it that yes, some people might have this problem of credibility. So why should, for example, diplomats waste their time on a tool which is not really credible, or which is not bulletproof? But this, I think this is a dangerous point of view if you have kind of open-minded that we should have. The starting point should be today. Tomorrow we don't know, today, but today. Is Wikipedia something, is Wikipedia a place, is Wikipedia a source which is being used widely by the so-called civil society, which means everything and nothing, of course. But let's say by students, by journalists, by the people of the road who have access with the computer, by sometimes intellectuals even. Is the answer to this question yes or no? Because if the answer is yes, and I think it is the answer, that's the point, even though there are many reserves, then we have to do something about it to make it credible. Or if not to make it credible as a Wikipedia world, which is maybe where Bence will do a little bit more than us, but in our little world concerning public information concerning our country, which means in a way public diplomacy, we should make something about it. We are responsible. It's not the responsibility of somebody else. If we want to do something good for our country, then we also have to acknowledge that there is a tool, that there is a source which is being used so much, and where we have the right to contribute, possibly honestly, and therefore if we contribute honestly with information which is more accurate, we also contribute it to make it more credible. And at the same time, we also do our job of performing some public diplomacy. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Now I'd like to give the floor to Jovan for him to make his final comments and remarks about it. Jovan.
Just a quick comment. From the ancient time, there were three elements in persuasion in rhetoric: is pathos, emotions, logos, logic, and ethos, values. Now, what is the good news for use of Wikipedia for public diplomacy? That we will be focusing more on ethos and logos, on the quality of information and ethically sound information. For diplomatic services worldwide, it is an important exercise, and I would say this could be an exercise with calculator in the hands. they can check how much money they invest in traditional public diplomacy, broadcasting, TV stations, adverts, and other tools, and compare with the possibility of establishing some sort of inclusive crowdsourcing project on Wikipedia, engaging universities, engaging experts, and trying to use in that way Wikipedia not only as a public diplomacy or broadcasting tool, but also platform to engage local people, nationals, to discuss the question of foreign policy and diplomacy. Therefore, there are so many collateral, if I can use this term, advantages of using Wikipedia, and it is difficult, except biases which we heard in discussion, and I completely subscribe to it, on the question of gender and the age, that should be filtered. But there are so many advantages when it comes to the foreign policy and diplomacy objectives, activities, having buy-in and support locally and the national level for the foreign policy activity, which is becoming increasingly important. We discuss public diplomacy towards the foreign countries, but ministries of foreign affairs have increasingly to convince their local public that they have useful function. Thank you. Over to you, Marilia.
Thank you very much, Jovan. We have other comments coming from the floor. Omar mentions, we should consider Wikipedia as a work in progress. It may not be as reliable as primary source, but is the closest we have to ancient Alexandria's library. Another comment that is coming from Petro. Well, we use it because we have no choice. I ask for something I do not know, the search engine will push me into Wikipedia. And I like this comment very much because I think this is true. This is true for everybody. It's the top search. Many people rely this as a first source of information. And I think, and now speaking as someone who studies international relations, that is a waste if we think that 92% of people in this pool, and if we consider the traffic that goes to Wikipedia, which is the sixth website more accessed in the world, that we don't take advantage of this space to give sound, useful information to people. It is the first information for many people who are researching. Maybe it is the only information for some journalists who is pressed and has a time to finish a text. You look into Wikipedia, see what's going on, and write the text. So I think it's a very useful space. It's a very popular space, and I think that it would be very interesting for us to contribute to that. So we are approaching the end of our debate. I'd like to thank our speakers very much for coming here today. I'd like to thank you that have sent us very interesting comments from the floor. It has been a wonderful debate. And I think that the debate will go on. As I mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, this is an initiative that Diplo is fostering to try to bring together the Wikipedia community and the diplomatic community. And we will go on with this initiative. There will be more activities coming up. If you are interested on the topics, or if you want to dig deeper into some of the issues that we have discussed here today, such as how to edit in practical terms, how to edit a Wikipedia article, what are the terms that apply, what are the norms of the platform, what is the Wikipedia community in practical terms, then you should come to our website. We will be publishing more information about it soon. It's diplomacy.edu. So once more, I'd like to thank you all again for coming and for watching us today. Yes, please, Jovan.
I'm sorry, thank you. Just one quick comment. This initiative on Wikipedia started in cooperation with the Istituto Diplomatico of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy, and we are trying to enlarge the network of diplomatic training institutes to join us in this endeavor, which is so skillfully guided by you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jovan, and thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, bye-bye, and see you on the next webinar.